In the unforgiving expanse of the American frontier, where dust-swept streets hold countless untold stories, there's a tale that still echoes through the saloons of Crimson Gulch. They say the devil himself once walked into town wearing a dress, carrying not a pitchfork, but a secret darker than the bottom of a mine shaft. This is the story of Sarah Mae Dixon, the girl who served whiskey with a smile and vengeance with a steady hand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The setting sun painted Crimson Gulch's main street in hues of amber and blood red, a fitting palette for what was about to unfold. The White Stallion Saloon stood like a weathered sentinel at the edge of town, its creaking signs swaying gently in the evening breeze. Inside, the usual symphony of clinking glasses, drunken laughter, and out-of-tune piano music filled the air. Sarah Mae Dixon moved between the tables, with the grace of a desert flower bending in the wind. Her dark hair was neatly pinned back, save for a few rebellious strands that framed her face. She'd been working at the White Stallion for 3 months now, and old Jim Wheeler, the owner, already called her his lucky charm. Business had never been better since she arrived. "Another round, Miss Sarah," called out Thompson, a local rancher who'd been drowning his sorrows since noon. His cattle drive had gone south, quite literally, when half his herd scattered during a storm. "Coming right up," Sarah replied, her voice carrying a hint of sweetness that seemed out of place in the rough establishment. As she turned toward the bar, her eyes caught something in the dusty mirror behind the bottles. 3 unfamiliar riders tying their horses outside. The saloon's batwing doors creaked open, and the piano's jangling tune faltered for a moment. The newcomers cast long shadows across the wooden floor, their spurs clicking with each step. Sarah had seen their kind before, the type of men who carried trouble in their holsters and violence in their eyes. The leader, a tall man with a face marked by a jagged scar running from his left eye to his jaw, scanned the room before settling his gaze on Sarah. His duster coat was covered in trail dust, and the gun belt slung low on his hips had notches carved into the leather, too many to count in the dim light. "Well, ain't this a sight for sore eyes?" he drawled, removing his hat to reveal graying hair. "Didn't expect to find such a pretty flower blooming in this dirt patch of a town." Old Jim Wheeler tensed behind the bar, his hand disappearing beneath the counter where Sarah knew he kept a shotgun. The local patrons suddenly found their drinks fascinating, all except for young Deputy Marshal Cole, who watched the scene unfold with nervous attention. "What can I get you, gentlemen?" Sarah asked, maintaining her practiced smile while her right hand brushed against the side of her dress. The familiar shape there brought comfort, though she hadn't needed to reach for it in months. "Whiskey," the scarred man replied, "and some company if you're offering." His companions chuckled, spreading out to take positions at different points in the room. One leaned against the bar, while the other claimed a table with a clear view of the entrance. Sarah retrieved a bottle and 3 glasses, setting them before the men with practiced efficiency. "That'll be 3 bits," she said, already turning. "To leave." The scarred man's hand shot out, catching her wrist. His grip was iron, but his smile remained eerily pleasant. "Name's Marcus Kane. These are my associates, Rook and Fletcher. We've been riding hard from Socorro, and we aim to enjoy some proper hospitality." Sarah's smile didn't waver, though something flickered in her eyes, something cold and calculating that Kane might have noticed if he hadn't been so focused on her physical charms. "Well, Mr. Kane, hospitality's what we're known for at the White Stallion, but a lady appreciates a gentle touch." Kane released her wrist with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "My apologies, Miss Dixon. Sarah Mae Dixon." "Miss Dixon," he repeated, rolling the name around like a sip of fine bourbon. "We'll be in town for a spell. Got some business to attend to with a former associate who's been mishandling some sensitive information." The way he said business made several patrons drain their glasses and decide it was time to head home. Thompson, however, had drunk himself past the point of good judgment. "You leave the girl be," he slurred, rising unsteadily from his chair. "We don't want any trouble here." Kane's hand moved to his gun, but Sarah stepped between them. "Mr. Thompson, let me help you home. You've had a long day, and Martha will be wondering where you are." She turned to Kane with an apologetic smile. "Poor man lost half his herd. Been drinking since morning." Kane's hand remained on his gun, but he nodded slowly. "Best get him home then, Miss Dixon. We wouldn't want any accidents." As Sarah helped Thompson toward the door, she caught snippets of conversation between Kane and his men. Words like gold shipment and inside man drifted through the tobacco smoke. More importantly, she heard a name that made her blood run cold: Rawlins. Outside, the street had grown dark, but Sarah's mind was illuminated by memories she'd fought. Hard to bury, 3 months of peace shattered by a single name. As she steadied Thompson, her fingers once again found the familiar shape sewn into her dress, a specially modified derringer, small enough to hide but deadly in the right hands. "Thank you, Miss Sarah," Thompson mumbled as she helped him onto his horse. "Those men, they ain't right." "No, Mr. Thompson, they surely ain't," Sarah replied softly, watching him sway in the saddle as he rode away. Her mind was already racing, calculating odds and possibilities. If Kane and his gang were connected to Rawlins, then her carefully constructed new life was about to unravel. Back in the saloon, Kane and his men had claimed the best table in the house. Their eyes followed Sarah as she resumed her duties, but now she moved differently, subtle changes in her posture and rhythm that would have been invisible to most observers. Like a rattler coiling before a strike, every movement had purpose. "Jim," she called softly to the owner, "I'm feeling a mite poorly. Mind if I retire early tonight?" The old man nodded, concern evident in his weathered face. "Course, Sarah. Been a long day. You rest up now." As she climbed the stairs to her room above the saloon, Sarah could feel Kane's eyes following her. Let him look, she thought. Let him think he had found easy prey in a simple saloon girl. Tomorrow would bring what it brought, and Sarah May Dixon, if that was even her real name, would be ready. In her room she lit a single candle and moved to the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Inside the hidden space lay a wooden box she hadn't opened since arriving in Crimson Gulch. The box contained the truth about who she really was, along with enough ammunition to make sure Marcus Kane and his gang would regret ever walking into the White Stallion Saloon. As she ran her fingers over the box's worn surface, Sarah whispered a phrase she hadn't spoken in months. "Forgive me, Father, for what I must do." The night wind howled outside her window, carrying with it the distant sound of coyotes. From somewhere down the street came the sound of breaking glass, followed by raucous laughter, Kane's men making themselves at home. Sarah pulled a worn, leather-bound journal from the box, its pages yellow with age. Inside, newspaper clippings told a story that few knew. A massacre in Dove Creek, a burning courthouse in Santa Fe, and a name that appeared in each article. The Ghost, they called the perpetrator. Some said it was a man seeking revenge. Others whispered about a woman. With dead eyes and steady hands, none knew the truth, and those who got close didn't live to tell about it. "Miss Sarah?" A soft knock at her door made her quickly replace the floorboard. "It's Cole, Deputy Cole." She opened the door to find the young lawman shifting nervously in the hallway. At 24, he was the youngest deputy marshal in the territory, and the only one who seemed to notice there was something different about Sarah May Dixon. "Deputy?" she acknowledged, keeping her voice low. "It's late for a social call." Cole removed his hat, crushing it between fidgeting hands. "Those men downstairs. I sent a telegram to Silver City about them. Got a reply just now." He glanced over his shoulder before continuing. "They're wanted in 3 territories: murder, robbery, Worse things. I thought you should know, being that they seem interested in you." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "That's thoughtful of you, Deputy, but I can handle unwanted attention." "The thing is," Cole pressed on, "there's something else." The reply mentioned they used to ride with someone called Rawlins. Nathan Rawlins. Sarah's face remained carefully neutral, but her fingers tightened on the doorframe. "That name is supposed to mean something to me?" "Maybe not, but—" Cole lowered his voice further. "When I said it just now, your left hand moved like it was reaching for a gun. Only someone with experience does that, and you don't strike me as just a saloon girl, Miss Sarah." For a long moment, they stared at each other in the dim hallway. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice carrying an edge Cole had never heard before. "You're observant, Deputy. Too observant. Take my advice. When Kane and his men make their move, stay out of it. Whatever's coming, it ain't your fight. The law's my business, Miss Sarah. If there's trouble brewing, the law—" A bitter smile crossed her face. "Was it the law that hanged my father for a crime he didn't commit? Was it the law that let Rawlins and his kind buy judges and marshals like they were buying cattle?" She caught herself, realizing she'd said too much. "Go home, Deputy Cole. Lock your door tonight, and if you hear shooting, don't be a hero." Before Cole could respond, she closed the door. Through the wood, she heard him stand there for several moments before his boots finally clicked away. Down the hall, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Back at the hidden box, Sarah removed a false bottom to reveal what lay. Beneath the newspaper clippings, a matched pair of Remington 1875 revolvers with pearl grips. They had belonged to her father, a judge who believed in justice more than his own survival. The guns had been a gift from her mother, who died bringing Sarah into the world. The irony wasn't lost on her. Those same guns had later served as tools of vengeance when justice failed. Sarah checked each cylinder with practiced ease, muscle memory from a life she'd tried to leave behind taking over. The weapons felt like old friends in her hands, familiar and deadly. She'd need them soon. Enough. Kane's arrival wasn't a coincidence. Rawlins must have finally tracked her down. From downstairs came the sound of the piano starting up again, a jarring rendition of Buffalo Gals, competing with the thunder that now rolled across the sky. A storm was indeed brewing in Crimson Gulch, one that would wash the streets clean with blood. As she prepared for what was to come, Sarah thought about Deputy Cole's words. He was right about one thing. She wasn't just a saloon girl. She was the daughter of Judge William Dixon, the man who dared to stand against the territory's corrupt power brokers. She was the woman who had spent 3 years hunting down every man responsible for her father's murder. She was the ghost that haunted the nightmares of men like Kane and Rawlins. And tomorrow they will learn why. Dawn broke over Crimson Gulch like a fever, the sun painting the clouds in shades of sickly yellow and grey. Sarah watched from her window as the town slowly stirred to life, counting the horses still tied up outside the hotel where Kane and his men had taken rooms. 5 horses now, not 3, which meant they'd been joined by others during the night. The Derringer pressed against her ribs as she made her way downstairs, her father's revolvers carefully hidden in a compartment beneath the loose step-on. The back stairs. She'd need them soon enough, but for now the smaller weapon would suffice. The saloon was empty save for old Jim, who was already wiping down the bar with his perpetually dirty rag. "These fellows were asking about you after." "You went up," Jim said without looking up. "The scarred one, Kane. He was mighty interested in knowing how long you'd been here." Sarah started arranging chairs around the tables. "And what did you tell him?" "That it ain't my business to discuss my employees' personal matters." Jim finally looked up, his rheumy eyes sharp despite his age. "But something ain't right about them men, Sarah. The way they move, the way they watch everything. They ain't just common bandits." "No, Sarah agreed softly. They ain't. The batwing doors swung open, letting in a shaft of morning light along with Deputy Cole. He looked like he hadn't slept, his young face lined with worry. "Miss Sarah," he nodded, then turned to Jim. "Mr. Wheeler, mind if I have a word with you?" Both. Before either could respond, heavy boots sounded on the boardwalk outside. Kane and his men filed in, now accompanied by two newcomers. A hulking Mexican who had to turn sideways to fit through the door, and a wiry man with a face like a ferret and a cavalry officer's coat that had seen better days. "Well now," Kane drawled, "ain't this cozy? Having a morning meeting, are we?" Cole's hand drifted toward his gun, but Sarah stepped forward, plastering on her practiced smile. "Breakfast won't be ready for another hour, gentlemen, but I can offer coffee in the meantime." "Coffee would be fine," Kane smiled, showing many teeth, "and some private conversation if you'd oblige me, Miss Dixon, or should I say, Miss Harrison." The name hit Sarah like a physical blow, though she didn't let it show on her face. She hadn't heard that name in 3 years, not since the day she'd buried it along with her old life in the ashes of the Santa Fe courthouse. "I'm afraid you've got me confused with someone else," she said, moving behind the bar, where she'd have better cover if things went bad. "Coffee's brewing fresh. Won't take but a minute." The ferret-faced man in the cavalry coat snickered. "Oh, she's good, Kane, real good, just like Rawlins said she'd be." "Shut your mouth, Hawkins," Kane snapped, then turned back to Sarah with an almost apologetic smile. "Pardon my associate's poor manners, but we both know who you are, Catherine Harrison, daughter of the late Judge William Harrison, or Dixon, as he was calling himself near the end." Sarah's hand had found the derringer, but she forced herself to remain still. 6 of them, all armed, and Cole looking mighty jumpy with his hand, hovering over his gun. The odds weren't good, not yet. "I think you boys better leave," Jim said, reaching for his shotgun. The huge Mexican moved faster than seemed possible for a man his size. In 2 strides, he was behind Jim, a knife pressed to the old man's throat. "The gun stays where it is, viejo." "Now then," Kane continued as if nothing had happened, "we can do this civilized-like, or we can paint the walls with your friends here. Rawlins wants to talk, that's all. Clear up some misunderstandings about what happened in Santa Fe." "Misunderstandings?" Sarah's voice was soft, dangerous, like how he misunderstood his oath to uphold the law, or how he misunderstood that bribing judges and murdering the honest ones might have consequences. Kane's face hardened. 3 years is a long time to hold a grudge, Miss Harrison. Lot of water under the bridge, lots of bodies, too. Some folks might start wondering who really burned down that courthouse with all these people inside." "That's enough," Cole interrupted, drawing his gun. "I'm placing you all under arrest." The room erupted in laughter. Even Kane cracked a smile, though his eyes remained cold. "Son, I admire your spirit, but you might want to count heads here. 6 of us, 1 of you. And the lady, well, she's who we came for anyway." 2, Jim growled, despite the knife at his throat. 2 of us. 3, came a new voice from the door. Everyone turned to see Thompson, the rancher from the night before, standing there with a Winchester rifle leveled at Kane's back. "Figured something wasn't right. Came back to check on Miss Sarah. Glad I did." Sarah wanted to scream at them all to run, to get away before they got themselves killed. Good men, brave men, but they didn't understand what they were dealing with. Kane and his bunch weren't just hired guns. They were something worse. They were the hands of corrupt power, the kind that could make a man's death look like justice. "Well, now," Kane said, spreading his hands in a gesture of mock surrender, "seems we got ourselves a proper standoff. Question is, who's going to be the first to—" The rest of his words were drowned out by the thunder of hooves outside. Through the windows, Sarah could see riders coming in fast. At least a dozen men in dusters, all armed. Her heart sank as she recognized the silver star badges they wore. "Marshall's men," Cole said, relief evident in his voice. "Looks like that telegram I sent brought some help." But Sarah knew better. She'd seen those badges before, in Santa Fe. They weren't real. Marshall's. They were Rawlins's men, bought and paid for like everything else in his corrupt empire. The odds had just gotten a lot worse. Kane's smile widened. "Like I said, Miss Harrison, we can do this civilized-like, or we can do it the hard way. Your choice. But remember, whatever happens to these fine folks, that's on your conscience." Sarah looked at Jim, who had raised her like a daughter these past 3 months. At Cole, too young and too honest for his own good. At Thompson, who'd come back to help despite his better judgment. Good people who didn't deserve to die for her. His sins, but as she opened her mouth to surrender, to try to save their lives, a strange sound cut through the morning air, a whistle, high and clear, coming from somewhere down the street. Kane's head snapped around at the sound, his face suddenly pale. "No," he whispered. "He's dead. We killed him in Dodge." The whistle came again, closer now. Sarah felt a smile tugging at her lips. A real one this time. Not the practiced mask. She showed to customers. She knew that whistle, knew it meant that maybe, just maybe, the odds weren't as bad as they seemed. "You're right about one thing, Kane," she said softly, her hand tightening on the derringer. 3 years is a long time. Long enough to make some interesting friends. The whistle came a third time, right outside the saloon now, and with it came a voice Sarah hadn't heard in 2 years, rough as trail dust and smooth as aged whiskey. "Anybody in there order some backup?" The words hung in the air like gun smoke, and Sarah watched as something she'd never seen before crossed Kane's face. Fear. The Mexican's knife wavered slightly against Jim's throat, and Hawkins took an unconscious step backward. Through the window, Sarah could see Rawlins's false marshals shifting uneasily in their saddles. They'd heard the whistle too, and from their reactions, they knew exactly what it meant. Ghost Rider. One of them muttered, loud enough to carry through the morning air. Sarah had heard the stories, same as everyone else. 3 years ago, when she'd started her quest for vengeance, she'd crossed paths with a man who became something of a legend in the territories. They called him the Ghost Rider, a former Texas Ranger turned vigilante who hunted corrupt lawmen. With the same dedication she hunted her father's killers. They'd worked together for a time until their paths diverged in Dodge City. She'd thought him dead after the ambush there, just as Kane had said. The batwing doors swung open slowly, deliberately. The man who stepped through them wore a duster, coat bleached almost white by sun and trail dust. His face was hidden in the shadow of a wide-brimmed black hat, but Sarah would have known that stance anywhere. Loose, but ready, like a coiled spring waiting to unleash. "Now this is what I'd call an interesting situation," the Ghost Rider drawled, his voice carrying clearly through the tense silence. 12 men outside wearing stolen badges, 6 more in here threatening good folks, and all of them working for a man who wouldn't know justice if it walked up and introduced itself. Kane's hand twitched toward his gun. "You're supposed to be dead. Been hearing that a lot lately." The Ghost Rider took another step forward, and now Sarah could see the familiar weathered face beneath the hat brim. 3 years had added some new scars, but those eyes were the same, sharp as a hawk's and cold as mountain snow. "Seems like rumors of my death were a mite exaggerated, much like rumors about certain courthouse fires and who might have started them." Sarah felt her breath catch. He knew. Somehow he'd figured out the truth about Santa Fe. "Miss Harrison here," the Ghost Rider continued. "She's been carrying that burden for 3 years now, taking the blame for something she didn't do while the real murderers walked free." His eyes fixed on Kane. "But you know all about that, don't you? Being that you were there that night, helping Rawlins frame an innocent woman for his own crimes." The Mexican's knife had dropped away from Jim's throat entirely now, and the old man took the opportunity to slowly edge away from his captor. Outside, 2 of Rawlins's men had already turned their horses, apparently deciding that no payment was worth facing the Ghost Rider's reputation. "You can't take all of us," Hawkins said. but his voice cracked on the words, "Don't need to." The Ghost Rider's smile was colder than a winter moon. "See, while you boys were all focused on this fine establishment, my friends were getting into position. Might want to look up at those windows across the street." Sarah followed his gaze. In the upper windows of the hotel and general store, she could see glints of sunlight on rifle barrels. More whistles sounded now from different directions, the Ghost Rider's signature way of coordinating his allies. "Way I figure it," he continued, "about half your men are already in Winchester range. Rest won't last 10 seconds once the shooting starts, so we can do this civilized or we can paint the walls." He turned Kane's own words back on him with deadly emphasis. Kane looked around the room, calculating odds that were getting worse by the second. "Rawlins won't let this go," he said finally. "You know that. He's got judges in his pocket, governors owing him favors. You really want to start a war?" "War started 3 years ago," Sarah spoke up, her voice steady, "when Rawlins had my father murdered for refusing to be bought. Everything since then has just been working toward the ending. And that ending's coming soon," the Ghost Rider added. "Real soon. But right now, you boys need to make a choice. Walk out of here alive or leave feet first." For a long moment, no one moved. Sarah could hear the wind outside, could smell the gun oil and nervous sweat in the air. Her hand remained on the derringer, knowing that despite the Ghost Rider's "back up," this could still go bad in a heartbeat. Finally, Kane nodded slowly. "Hawkins, Miguel, we're leaving. Tell the men outside to pull back." He turned to Sarah, and this time there was something like respect mixed with the fear in his eyes. "This ain't over, Miss Harrison. Man like Rawlins, he doesn't forgive and he doesn't forget." "Good," Sarah replied softly. "Neither do I." They backed out slowly, keeping their hands clear of their weapons. Outside, the fake marshals were already dispersing, wanting no part of what they'd realized was a carefully laid trap. Within minutes, the street was clear, except for a few townspeople peeking cautiously out their windows at the scene. The Ghost Rider waited until they were gone before turning to Sarah. "Been a while, partner." "Thought you were dead," she said, finally letting go of the derringer. "Came close to Dodge, closer in Tombstone. But I made a promise to help you clear your name, and I aim to keep it." He looked around at Jim, Cole, and Thompson. "Though it seems like you found some new friends willing to stand with you." "Didn't ask them to," Sarah said, but there was gratitude in her voice. "Nobody ever asks for help in this life." The Ghost Rider replied. "Good folks just give it anyway." He turned to Jim. "Hope you don't mind, but I took the liberty of setting up some friends in your upper rooms. Best they stay there a while. Keep watch in case Kane and his bunch get any ideas about coming back." Jim nodded, still processing everything that had happened. "Reckon I got some questions about my star employee here." "We all do," Cole added, holstering his gun but keeping his hand near it. "Starting with who she really is." Sarah looked at these. Men who had been willing to die for her without even knowing the truth. They deserved answers, but those answers would put them in even more danger. Before she could speak, the Ghost Rider stepped forward. "Maybe we should all sit down," he said. "Got a feeling this is going to be a long story. And when it's done—" He turned to Sarah with a grim smile. "We need to talk about Rawlins, because I found something in Dodge City that changes everything we thought we knew about what really happened in Santa Fe." Jim started brewing fresh coffee, while Sarah and the others gathered around the largest table in the saloon. Through the windows, she could see the Ghost Rider's men maintaining their positions, rifles still trained on the street below. She recognized a few faces: Hard Luck Harris, the Delaney brothers, even old Scout Eye Wilson with his distinctive brass spyglass. The Ghost Rider had assembled quite a crew. "First things first," the Ghost Rider said, setting his hat on the table. In the better light, Sarah could see the new scars she'd noticed earlier, one along his jawline, another disappearing into his graying hair above his right ear. "Name's Marcus Clay, for those who don't know me." former Texas Ranger, before Rawlins's corruption spread into the Rangers themselves. The Marcus Clay. Cole leaned forward, eyes wide. The one who exposed the Red River conspiracy? That was a lifetime ago, Clay replied, his voice heavy with memory. Back when I still believed you could fight corruption from within the law. Before I learned that sometimes justice needs to wear a different face. Thompson cleared his throat. All due respect, Mr. Clay, but what's this got to do with Miss Sarah here? Or whatever her real name is? Catherine Harrison, Sarah said quietly. Though Sarah Dixon's become more than just a disguise these past few months. She looked at Jim, apologetically. I never meant to bring trouble to your door. Doors used to trouble, Jim growled, returning with the coffee, though usually not quite this much of it. Clay took a long sip of coffee before continuing. 3 years ago, Judge, William Harrison was one of the few honest judges left in the territory. He was building a case against Rawlins and his operation, the land grabs, the corrupted marshals, the murdered homesteaders. He had evidence that went all the way to the territorial governor. My father believed in the law, Sarah added, her hands wrapped tight around her coffee cup. Believed in it right up until the moment they put the noose around his neck. They framed him for taking bribes, Clay explained to the others. Planted evidence, paid off witnesses, made it look like he was the corrupt one, and when Catherine here tried to prove his innocence, they burned down the courthouse, Cole finished, understanding dawning in his young face, with all the evidence inside. I remember reading about it. Papers said a woman did it, killing 3 people in the process. Papers printed what Rawlins told them to print, Clay said grimly, just like the territorial marshals arrested who Rawlins told them to arrest. The whole system's rotted from the inside out. Sarah stood abruptly, moving to the window. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting hard shadows across the empty street. I was there that night, she said, her voice distant, trying to find the real evidence, the documents that would prove my father's innocence. But Rawlins's men were waiting. They set the fire, shot anyone who tried to escape. I barely made it out alive. And that's when you started hunting them, Thompson said. It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded. One by one, the corrupt judges, the bought witnesses, anyone who had a hand in my father's murder. Took a different name in each town, got close to them however I could. Some behind a bar, some... She trailed off, leaving the implications unspoken. Girls got quite a talent for disguise, Clay put in, and an even better talent for making bad men disappear. That's how we met, both hunting the same corrupt marshal in Dodge City, decided 2 ghosts were better than 1. Until Dodge, Sarah turned back to the group. Until they ambushed you. I thought, her voice caught slightly, I thought I'd lost the only ally I had left. Clay's weathered face softened. Took more than a few bullets to stop me, though I'll admit it was a close thing. Spent 6 months recovering with a tribe of Jicarilla Apache. By the time I got back on my feet, you'd disappeared. I had to keep moving, Sarah said. After Dodge, Rawlins's men were getting too close. I need to disappear for a while, figure out my next move. And you ended up here, Jim said, gesturing around his saloon. I needed a quiet place to lay low. Never meant to. Sarah looked at the old man with genuine regret. Never meant to start caring about people again. Makes everything more complicated. Life's complicated, Jim replied gruffly. Don't make it less worth living. Clay set his coffee cup down with a decisive click. Well, it's about to get more complicated. That thing I found in Dodge, it's proof, real proof, not just rumors and dying men's confessions. Documents showing exactly how Rawlins orchestrated the judge's murder and the courthouse fire. Names, dates, bank transfers, everything. Sarah's head snapped around. What? How? Rawlins's former accountant grew a conscience. He'd kept copies of everything. Insurance against the day Rawlins might turn on him. Which Rawlins did about 6 months ago. Clay's face darkened. Found the accountant too late to save him, but not too late to get the documents he'd hidden. So we can prove it, Sarah whispered. Really prove it this time. Won't be that simple. Cole cut in. From what you've said, Rawlins has judges and lawmen in his pocket all over the territory. Who'd even look at the evidence? That's the thing. Clay leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. 2 weeks ago, President Cleveland appointed a new federal judge to the territory, a man named Morrison, got a reputation for being incorruptible. More importantly, he's already opened investigations into several of Rawlins's associates. Hope flickered in Sarah's eyes, quickly replaced by suspicion. Rawlins will have him killed before we can get near him. Probably, Clay agreed, if he knew what was coming. But right now, Rawlins thinks I'm dead and you're running scared. He sent Kane here to flush you out, bring you back to him. He doesn't know about the documents, doesn't know about Judge Morrison. We've got a chance, maybe our only chance, to end this. All of it. When? Sarah asked. Morrison arrives in Santa Fe in 5 days. There's a hearing scheduled, some land dispute Rawlins is involved in. If we can get the documents to Morrison before Rawlins's men get to him... 5 days, Sarah repeated softly. She looked around the room, at Jim, who'd given her a home, at Cole, who'd tried to protect her without even knowing who she was, at Thompson, who'd come back to help a simple saloon girl. I can't ask any of you to get involved in this. It's not your fight. Like hell it ain't, Jim growled. You think Rawlins' poison hasn't touched this town? Think he hasn't squeezed honest ranchers like Thompson here with his water rights games? Man like that, hurting him is everybody's fight. Cole stood, squaring his young shoulders. I took an oath to uphold the law. Real law, not whatever Rawlins has turned it into. I'm in. Might have a few boys from the ranch willing to ride too, Thompson added. Once they hear the full story. Clay watched Sarah's face as the others voiced their support. Well, partner, ready to finish what we started? Sarah looked down at her hands, hands that had served drinks and dealt cards, hands that had also dealt death in the name of vengeance. Maybe it was time they did something different, something bigger than revenge. 5 days to justice, she said finally, or whatever's waiting for us in Santa Fe. She turned to Clay. But first, you better tell me exactly what was in those documents. And then we need to talk about Kane and his men, because they didn't ride away just to go quietly back to Rawlins. The afternoon sun beat down on Crimson Gulch like a hammer on hot iron, but the heat wasn't what made sweat bead on Deputy Cole's forehead as he watched Kane's men through his spyglass. They'd made camp just outside of town, close enough to keep an eye on things, but far enough to avoid another direct confrontation. Counting 8 men now, he reported, lowering the glass, plus Kane and his original group. They're setting up like they plan to stay a while. Sarah stood beside him on the roof of the general store, her father's revolvers now strapped openly to her hips. There was no point in hiding who she was anymore. They're waiting for something, she said. Or someone. Rawlins wouldn't come. Himself, would he? Cole asked, trying to keep the worry from his voice. No, Clay answered from behind them. But he's got other dogs to send. Worse ones than Kane. Sarah turned to face her old partner. In the harsh daylight, she could see how the years had worn on him. The Ghost Rider legend had cost him dearly. She could read it in the new lines. Around his eyes, the way he favored his right leg ever so slightly. You're thinking about the preacher, she said. It wasn't a question. Clay nodded grimly. Kane's not the type to wait around unless he's got backup coming, and there's only one man Rawlins would send that could make Kane this cautious. The preacher? Cole asked, confused. Like a real preacher? Nothing real about him except the people he's killed, Clay spat. Used to be an army chaplain until they caught him robbing dead soldiers. Now he works for men like Rawlins, using the Bible to justify whatever atrocities they want committed. Sarah's hand unconsciously touched the cross hanging at her neck. Her mother's, the only thing she had left of her besides memories. I've seen his work. Down in Las Cruces. He burned a whole family alive in their church, then quoted scripture. Over their ashes, a shadow passed over Clay's face. That business in Las Cruces, that's part of what I found in those documents. The preacher wasn't just following orders there. He was cleaning up loose ends for Rawlins, same as the courthouse fire. What do you mean? Sarah's voice had gone deadly quiet. The family in that church, they were witnesses. Your father had gotten to them first, gotten signed testimonies about Rawlins's land grabs. They were supposed to testify at the grand jury before they framed him, Sarah finished, her knuckles white on the roof's railing. Those people died because they tried to help my father. More than that, Clay said. According to the documents, they died because someone inside your father's inner circle told Rawlins about them. Someone close to the investigation. Sarah's head snapped up. Who? Name was in the papers, but parts were damaged. All I could make out was that it was someone your father trusted, someone who... He was cut off by the sound of a whistle from the street below, one of his men signaling. They all moved to the edge of the roof to look. A single rider was approaching from the direction of Kane's camp, moving at an unhurried pace. Even at this distance, Sarah could make out the distinctive black broadcloth coat and wide-brimmed black hat. Around the rider's neck, a priest's collar gleamed white in the sun. Speaking of the devil, Clay muttered. He's alone, Cole observed, raising his spyglass again. No, Sarah corrected him. Look at the windows in the buildings he's passing. Clay nodded approvingly. Good eye. His men are already in position. Probably been sneaking into town in ones and twos while we were focused on Kane's camp. What do we do? Cole asked. Spring their trap before they spring ours, Sarah said, checking her revolvers. The preacher's not here to take me back to Rawlins. He's here to make sure I never testify about what really happened in Santa Fe. Then, we need to get you out of town, Cole insisted. If those documents are as important as Mr. Clay says, running's not an option. Clay cut him off. The preacher's men will have the roads watched. Besides, he gave Sarah a knowing look, you weren't planning to run anyway, were you? Sarah shook her head. 3 years I've been hunting the men who killed my father. Now I find out there was a traitor close to him, someone he trusted. I'm not leaving until I know who it was. The preacher might know, Clay acknowledged, but he's not the type to give up information easily. Then we'll have to be persuasive, Sarah said coldly. She turned to Cole. Get word to Jim and Thompson. Tell them to get everyone off the streets. Anyone who stays out there once the preacher arrives is either with him or dead soon after. Cole hesitated. What about you? I'm going to go have a conversation about scripture with a man of the cloth. Clay caught her arm as she turned to leave. Sarah, Catherine, there's something else you should know. About the documents, about why Rawlins was so desperate to destroy them. Can it wait? No. Clay's face was deadly serious. Because it's about your mother. The land deals your father was investigating. They started 20 years ago with a mining claim that belonged to your mother's family. A claim that supposedly died with her. Sarah felt the world tilt slightly. What are you saying? I'm saying your mother's death might not have been from childbirth like you were told, and the person who told you that story, they might be the same person who betrayed your father. For a moment, Sarah couldn't breathe. Everything she thought she knew about her past seemed to shift like quicksand beneath her feet. But before she could process this new revelation, another whistle sounded. From below, urgent this time, the preacher had reached the center of town. He'd stopped his horse in front of the White Stallion Saloon and was looking up directly at their position on the roof. Even from this distance, Sarah could see his smile. The same smile he'd worn in Las Cruces while quoting psalms over the screams of dying children. Behold, his voice carried clearly in the hot afternoon air, she who dwelleth in the shadow of vengeance shall find only ashes and death. He spread his arms wide, the gesture almost benedictive. Come down, Miss Harrison. Let us discuss the wages of sin. Sarah checked her guns one final time. "Get everyone under cover," she told Cole. "And if you hear shooting—" She paused, remembering when she'd said these same words to him just that morning, in what felt like another lifetime. "Don't be a hero," Cole finished with a grim smile. "No," Sarah replied. "Be ready, because whatever happens next is going to change everything in this town." She turned to Clay. "Watch the windows. His men will want to catch me in a crossfire. When I go down there—" "Already got Harass and the Delaney's covering the high ground," Clay assured her. "But Sarah, about your mother—" "Later," she cut him off. "Right now, I need to focus on staying alive long enough to learn the whole truth." She started toward the roof access door, then paused. "But Clay, if I don't make it through this, find the traitor. Make them pay for both my parents." "Count on it," Clay promised. "Just like old times?" Sarah managed a small smile. "Just like old times, only this time—" Her hand touched her mother's cross again. "This time we will finish it. All of it." As she descended the stairs, Sarah's mind was already racing, calculating angles and positions, remembering everything she knew about the preacher's methods. He liked to talk, liked to play with his prey before striking. She could use that. But she also knew that behind his theatrical manner lay one of the deadliest gunmen in the territory. The saloon's batwing doors creaked as she pushed through them into the harsh afternoon light. The street was empty now, but she could feel eyes watching from every window, every doorway, the preacher's men and Clay's, all waiting to see what would happen next. The preacher sat his horse like a statue, black coat unstirred by the hot wind. Only his eyes moved, following her as she stepped into the street. Up close, she could see the silver cross pinned to his lapel, the same one he'd worn in Las Cruces. "Hello, preacher," Sarah said evenly, still using the good book to justify murder. "Every soul must answer for its sins, Miss Harrison." His voice was soft, almost gentle. "Your father understood that at the end. He died praying for forgiveness." Sarah's hands twitched toward her guns, but she forced them still. "Careful, preacher. Lying's still a sin, last I heard." He laughed, a dry sound like dead leaves scratching across a tombstone. "You want truth, child? Here's the truth for you. Everything you think you know about your past is built on lies. Your father's integrity, your mother's death, even your own quest for justice. All of it fiction, written by hands you never thought to question." "Clay found the documents," she said, watching his face carefully. "The real truth is coming. Out." Something flickered in the preacher's eyes, concern, fear, but his smile never wavered. "Documents can be forged, child. Trust can be misplaced. Even old friends can lead us down paths of deception." The emphasis he put on old friends made Sarah's blood run cold. Was he suggesting? No. It was another game, another attempt to make her doubt herself and her allies. "Enough riddles," she said. "You're here to kill me, so either start quoting scripture and drawing iron, or ride back to Cain and tell him you failed." The preacher shook his head sadly. "Always so direct, so worldly, just like your mother was before she learned the price of defiance." He reached inside his coat, but instead of a gun, he withdrew a folded piece of paper. "Perhaps you'd like to know what really happened to her. It's all here in her own words. Her last confession, you might say." Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. A trick, had to be a trick, and yet— "Throw it down," she ordered. The preacher held the paper out, letting it flutter in the hot wind. "Knowledge is a dangerous thing, Miss Harrison. Once gained, it cannot be unknown. Are you certain you want to learn how deep the betrayal goes?" Behind her, Sarah heard the soft scuff of a boot on wooden planking, someone moving into position. Above, the shadows in the windows shifted slightly. The trap was almost ready to spring on both sides. But looking at that paper dancing in the wind, Sarah realized something. For 3 years, she'd been focused on avenging her father, on clearing his name. But if what Clay had found in those documents was true, if her mother's death was somehow connected to all of this— "Last chance, preacher," she said. "That paper. For your life, walk away from Rawlins, testify about what really happened in Las Cruces and Santa Fe." He smiled again, but this time there was something almost like respect in his eyes. "My path was chosen long ago, child. The only question is—" His hand moved like lightning, the paper falling as his gun cleared leather. "What path will you die on?" Time seemed to slow as Sarah watched the paper drift toward the dust. In that frozen moment, she saw everything with crystal clarity: the slight tensing of the preacher's trigger finger, the shadows moving in the windows above, the way his coat rippled to reveal the second gun hidden beneath it. Most importantly, she saw the glint of sunlight on brass in the window of the telegraph office behind him. Sarah didn't dive for the paper. Instead, she dropped straight down as the preacher's first shot cracked above her head. Clay's men opened fire from their positions, forcing the preacher's hidden gunmen to duck for cover. The street erupted into chaos. Rolling behind a water trough, Sarah drew both revolvers. "Ecclesiastes 3:8, she called out, her voice carrying over the gunfire. "A time for war and a time for peace." The preacher's laugh rang out as he dismounted, using his spooked horse for cover. "Quoting scripture at me, child. How ambitious." His gun barked twice, splintering the wood near her head. "Perhaps Psalms 34:21 is more fitting. Evil shall slay the wicked." "You forgot the rest of that verse," Sarah replied, popping up, to squeeze off 2 quick shots that forced him to duck. "About those who hate the righteous being condemned." Movement caught her eye, one of the preacher's men trying to work his way around to her flank. She put a bullet through his shoulder without hesitation, sending him sprawling in the dust. The paper containing her mother's supposed confession had settled in the middle of the street, held down by a small rock that hadn't been there before. Sarah knew it was another trick, a way to draw her out into the open, but the questions it represented burned in her mind. "Your mother asked for me, you know," the preacher called out, his voice deceptively conversational despite the ongoing gunfight. At the end, when she realized what was happening to her, she begged for last rites, for absolution of her sins. "More lies," Sarah gritted through clenched teeth, but doubt gnawed at her. What if— A whistle cut through the air, one of Clay's signals. 3 short bursts, enemy reinforcements coming. Kane's men must have decided to join the party. "Running. Out of time, Miss Harrison," the preacher taunted. "So many secrets dying with me, if you don't survive to hear them. About your mother, about the traitor in your father's circle, about why Rawlins really wants you dead." Sarah's mind raced. The paper was a trap, but maybe— She fired both revolvers at the windows above the preacher, forcing his men to duck. In that moment of covering fire, she shouted, "Thompson, now!" The rancher's rifle cracked from his hidden position in the livery stable. The bullet struck exactly where Sarah had told him to aim, the rock holding down the paper. The small stone exploded, the force sending the paper skittering across the dusty street toward her position. The preacher's reaction told her everything she needed to know. His calm facade cracked for just a moment, real anger flashing across his face. Whatever was on that paper, he hadn't expected her to actually get her hands on it. Sarah snatched the document one-handed while maintaining fire with her other revolver. She stuffed it quickly into her shirt. There'd be time to read it later, assuming she survived the next few minutes. "Clever girl," the preacher said, but there was a new edge to his voice. "Just like your mother. She was clever too, right? Up until—" His words were cut off by the thunder of approaching hooves. Kane's men were arriving, firing as they rode in, but they weren't alone. More whistles sounded from different directions, Clay's reinforcements joining the fight. "Looks like the congregation's growing, preacher," Sarah called out. "Hope you brought enough scripture for everyone." "Revelations 13:10, he replied, his voice gone cold. He that leadeth into captivity shall go into captivity. He that killeth with the sword must be killed with the sword. 2 shots punched through the water trough, uncomfortably close to where Sarah crouched. "You want revelation?" Sarah fired back, both with words and bullets. "Here's some truth for you. I know why you're really here. Those documents Clay found, they don't just implicate Rawlins. They implicate you too, don't they? The courthouse fire, Las Cruces. You weren't just following orders. You were protecting yourself." The preacher's next shot went wide, the first time she'd ever seen him miss. She'd struck a nerve. "You have no idea what forces you're playing with, child," he snarled, abandoning his scripture quotations entirely. "What's written in those documents could burn this whole territory to the ground." "Then maybe it needs burning," Sarah replied. "Time to clean house, starting with false prophets like you." She heard Clay's voice from somewhere above. "Sarah! Company coming!" The thunder of hooves was growing louder. Through the gaps in the water trough, Sarah could see dust clouds rising from both ends of the street. This was about to get much more complicated. "Last chance, preacher," she called out. "Surrender now. Tell me what you know about my mother, and maybe you'll live to see tomorrow's sunrise." His response was another shot that splintered the wood by her head. "Child, when this day is done, the only truth you'll know is the judgment that awaits all sinners." Sarah checked her ammunition. 4 rounds left in one revolver, 3 in the other. The paper pressed against her skin like a brand, its secrets burning to be revealed. But first, she had to survive what was coming. "Clay!" she shouted. "Remember!" "Dodge! God, not again!" she heard him mutter, but she knew he'd back her play. It was time to end this, one way or another. Sarah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her guns, the press of the paper, the heavy reality of all the lies and secrets that had led to this moment. Then she began to pray, not to the preachers, vengeful God, but to whatever force of justice might be listening. "All right, you false prophet," she whispered. "Let's see what kind of miracle you've got left in you." The street erupted in fresh gunfire as riders appeared at both ends of town. Sarah tensed, ready to make her move. One way or another, the truth about her mother, about the traitor, about all of it, was about to come out, and heaven help anyone who tries to stop it. The first group of riders burst into view, but they weren't Kane's men. Sarah recognized the distinctive red bandanas of the Carson City gang, hired guns, known for their loyalty to the highest bidder. From the other direction came the sound of more horses, and through the dust she caught glimpses of the silver badges that marked Rawlins's corrupt lawmen. "Quite a congregation you've gathered, preacher," Sarah called out, trying to keep him talking while she assessed the new threats. "How many pieces of silver did Rawlins pay for all this?" "You still don't understand, child," the preacher replied. His voice had changed, dropping the theatrical religious tone for something colder, more pragmatic. "This was never about Rawlins. He's just another puppet, like Kane, like those badge-wearing dogs riding in. There are higher powers at work here." Above, Clay's voice cut through the chaos. "Sarah, the telegraph office." She risked a quick glance and saw movement inside. Someone was using the confusion of the gunfight as cover. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of a familiar face that made her blood run cold. "Judge Wilson?" she whispered in disbelief. The dear man who had presided over her father's trial, who had sentenced him to hang, was here in Crimson Gulch. But why? Unless... "The pieces finally falling into place?" the preacher asked, and now there was something almost like pity in his voice. "Your father wasn't investigating just Rawlins's land deals. He'd uncovered something bigger, something that went all the way to—" A shot rang out from the telegraph office, cutting off the preacher's words. The bullet kicked up dust at his feet, and Sarah saw real fear cross his face for the first time. "No more talking," Judge Wilson's voice carried from the window. "Finish it, preacher. Those documents cannot reach Santa Fe." Sarah's mind raced. Wilson's presence changed everything. If he was here personally, then whatever was in those documents Clay had found must be even more damaging than they'd thought. "Deputy Cole!" she shouted. "The paper! Get it to Clay!" She pulled the document from her shirt and slid it across the ground toward where Cole was positioned behind a stack of barrels. The young deputy darted out to grab it, bullets kicking up dust around him. "Stop him!" Wilson commanded. The preacher raised his gun, but Sarah was faster. Her shot forced him back behind his horse as Cole made it to cover with the paper. "You're too late," Sarah told the preacher. "Even if you kill us all, Clay's men will get those documents to Judge Morrison. It's over." The preacher's laugh was harsh. "Morrison? Oh, child, who do you think sent me to Las Cruces in the first place? Who do you think signed your father's death warrant before Wilson ever picked up his gavel?" Sarah felt the world tilt beneath her. "No, the corruption goes all the way to Washington," the preacher continued. "Railroad companies, mining interests, territorial governors, all of them feeding from the same trough. Your father stumbled onto the edge of it, but your mother, she was born into it." From the telegraph office, Wilson shouted, "Enough! Kill them all!" The street erupted in chaos as both groups of riders charged. But amid the thunder of hooves and gunfire, Sarah heard something else, a sound that made her smile for the first time since the shooting started, a train whistle coming from the south. "Right on time," Clay called down. "Just like Dodge," Sarah remembered now. The train tracks ran right behind the telegraph office, and if Clay had planned this the way he had in Dodge, the explosion rocked the street, sending Wilson and his men diving for cover as the back wall of the telegraph office collapsed. Through the dust and debris, Sarah saw riders approaching from the south. Not more enemies, but the cavalry patrol Clay had telegraphed for before all this started. "Federal marshals!" a voice boomed out. "Drop your weapons!" The preacher's face contorted with rage. His gun came up, aiming not at Sarah but at the paper in Cole's hand. "The truth dies here." Sarah threw herself forward, both revolvers blazing. Time seemed to slow as she saw the preacher's finger tighten on the trigger, saw Cole trying to dive away, saw Judge Wilson taking aim from the ruined telegraph office. 3 shots rang out as one. The paper fluttered in the hot wind, untouched. The preacher staggered, red blossoming on his black coat, but his gun hand was steady as he turned back to Sarah, a final verse on his lips. Proverbs 16:18, "Pride goeth before destruction." Sarah felt the impact of his bullet, but her own. Shots had already found their mark. The preacher folded slowly, his final words lost in the dust. As she slumped against the water trough, Sarah saw Wilson and his men surrendering to the federal marshals. The Carson City riders were retreating, and Kane's men were nowhere to be seen. They'd won, or at least survived. Clay was at her side in an instant, pressing a bandage to her wound. "Just like Dodge," he said grimly. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic." "The paper," she gasped. "What does it say?" Cole brought it over, his hands shaking slightly as he unfolded it. His eyes widened as he read. "It's a letter," he said, "from your mother, written the day she died." He swallowed hard. "It's addressed to Judge Morrison." Sarah tried to sit up, but Clay held her down. "Easy," he warned. "The bleeding's not bad, but you need to stay still." "Read it," she ordered Cole. The young deputy cleared his throat and began to read. "My dearest friend, by the time you receive this, I will likely be dead. They know I plan to testify about the mining contracts, about what my father and the others have done. William suspects nothing. I couldn't bear to tell him that my own family is behind everything he's investigating. But you deserve to know the truth, all of it. The evidence is hidden in—" Cole stopped reading, his face pale. "What?" Sarah demanded. "Hidden where?" But before Cole could continue, another voice spoke from behind them. A voice Sarah hadn't heard in 3 years, one that brought back memories of courthouse fires and hanging judges. Now that Nathan Rawlins said pleasantly, stepping out of the crowd that had gathered, is something we'd all like to know. Nathan Rawlins looked exactly as Sarah remembered him, tall and well-dressed with silver hair, and the kind of smile that could charm rattlesnakes. He wore no gun, carried no badge of authority. He didn't need to. The power he wielded came from darker places than any marshal's office. "My dear Catherine," he said, stepping forward as the crowd parted before him like water, "you've certainly caused quite a stir, though I suppose I shouldn't be surprised. You always did take after your mother." Sarah's wound throbbed as Clay helped her to her feet, but she kept both revolvers trained on Rawlins. "Don't talk about my mother, not after what you did to her." "What did I did?" Rawlins's smile never wavered. "My dear, I tried to protect Elizabeth, to protect both of you. If she had just listened to reason, accepted the way things had to be, the way things had to be." Sarah's voice cracked with rage. "You had my father hanged, burned innocent people alive to cover your tracks." Rawlins sighed, as if disappointed by her lack of understanding. "Your father was an idealist. Like you, he saw everything in black and white. But the world runs on shades of grey, my dear. Always has." The federal marshals were moving to surround them, but Rawlins raised a hand. From the gathered crowd, men in suits emerged, government agents by their bearing. The marshals stopped in their tracks. "Stand down," one of the agents ordered. "This is a matter of territorial security." Clay's voice was low and dangerous. "More corrupt badges, Rawlins? How deep does this rot go?" "Deeper than you can imagine." "Mr. Clay," Rawlins clasped his hands behind his back, entirely at ease despite the guns pointed at him. "Did you really think a few documents would be enough to bring down an empire built over generations? That one honest judge in Santa Fe could undo decades of carefully maintained order?" "Order?" Sarah spat the word. "Is that what you call it?" "What would you call it?" Rawlins countered. "The railroad doesn't build itself. Cities don't rise from the desert by accident. Progress demands compromise. Your mother understood that before the end. Her family had been part of it for years, helping to shape the territory's destiny." Sarah felt Cole tense beside her. The young deputy still held her mother's letter, and she saw Rawlins's eyes flick to it. "Ah, yes," Rawlins smiled. "Elizabeth's final confession. I've been looking for that for a very long time. The last piece of a rather complicated puzzle." He extended his hand. "The letter, deputy. Now." "Don't," Sarah warned, but Cole was already backing away, the paper clutched to his chest. "The boy has sense," Rawlins approved. "He understands that some secrets are better left buried, like the real reason your mother died, Catherine. The truth about her family's connection to everything that's happened, about why Judge Morrison is so very interested in this case." Sarah's mind raced. "Morrison, you said he was part of this, that he ordered the massacre in Las Cruces." "Did I?" Rawlins raised an eyebrow. "Or did the preacher say that? Poor man, his zealotry sometimes led him to embellish the truth. No, Judge Morrison is quite real and quite honest. That's what makes him so dangerous. If he were corrupt, he could be bought. If he were a coward, he could be threatened. But a true believer in justice." He shook his head sadly. "They require more permanent solutions." "The hearing in Santa Fe," Clay growled. "It's a trap." "Of course it is," Rawlins agreed. "Just like this little ambush of yours was a trap. The difference is, my traps tend to work." He raised his voice slightly. "Isn't that right, James?" Old Jim Wheeler stepped out of the saloon, a shotgun in his hands, but it wasn't pointed at Rawlins. It was aimed at Sarah's back. "I'm sorry, girl." The old man's voice was heavy with genuine regret. "Been working for Mr. Rawlins longer than you've been alive. Couldn't let you upset things now." Sarah felt the betrayal like a physical blow. "Jim, you were like a father to me, and that's why you're still breathing," Jim replied. Told Mr. Rawlins you could be reasoned with if you knew the whole truth, about your mother, about what's really at stake here. The truth? Sarah laughed bitterly. Seems like everyone wants to tell me their version of the truth today. Then, let me show you instead, Rawlins offered. He reached into his coat, moving slowly to avoid spooking anyone's trigger finger. What he withdrew was a small leather-bound book, a diary by its look. Your mother's private journal, the real one, not the sanitized version you grew up reading. The story of how the Harrison family helped build this territory, one secret deal at a time. Of how your grandfather used his mining empire to fund judges and governors who would shape the law to benefit men of vision. Vision? Clay's voice dripped with contempt. Is that what you call greed these days? Progress, Mr. Clay, the inexorable march of civilization. Elizabeth understood that, even if she came to regret her part in it. And now, Rawlins' eyes fixed on Sarah. Now you have a choice to make, my dear. The same choice your mother faced. You can die a martyr to a lost cause like your father. Or you can take your rightful place in the grand design. Your mother's family legacy awaits. All that power, all that influence. It could be yours. Sarah felt the weight of it all pressing down on her. The lies, the betrayals, the generations of corruption that had shaped her life without her knowing. But something wasn't adding up. If what you're saying is true, she said slowly, if my mother's family was part of all this, why kill her? Why not just let her keep their secrets? For the first time, Rawlins's smile faltered slightly. Because, my dear, she found something in her father's papers, something even I didn't know existed. A document that could unravel everything, not just here in the territory, but all the way to Washington. The very foundation of Western expansion laid bare in black and white. That's what she hid, what Judge Morrison is really looking for. The letter your young deputy holds is the key to finding it. And if I help you find it, Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer, then you live, your friends live, and you take your place among the people who truly rule this territory. Just imagine, Catherine, all the power your father fought against, turned instead to the cause of justice, real justice, not these noble but futile gestures. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, appearing to consider his words. She saw Jim's grip tighten on the shotgun, saw Cole's knuckles whiten around her mother's letter. She felt Clay tensing beside her, ready to move at her signal. You know what? I've been thinking about Rawlins, she said finally. Something the preacher said before you got here, about pride going before destruction. Rawlins's eyes narrowed. Meaning? Meaning you're not the only one who had 3 years to plan. Sarah smiled, a cold, dangerous expression that transformed her whole face. Jim! The old man's shotgun swung around with shocking speed, catching one of Rawlins' agents in the chest before anyone could react. At the same moment, the roof of the saloon erupted with gunfire as Clay's hidden men opened up on the other agents. You see, Sarah continued as chaos erupted around them, I knew there had to be a spy in town. I knew Jim had worked for you for years, so I told him a slightly different plan than everyone else. Let him report that we were falling for your trap. While setting one of your own, Rawlins finished, real admiration in his voice despite the situation. Impressive, but futile. Even if you kill me, there are others. The system is bigger than any one person. Maybe, Sarah acknowledged, as more of Clay's men emerged from hiding to surround them. But it's going to be hard for that system to function. When every corrupt judge and bought lawman in the territory is exposed. The documents Clay found, we didn't just find one set. We found copies, lots of copies, already distributed to newspapers from here to St. Louis. The color drained from Rawlins's face. You're bluffing, am I? Guess you'll find out when the morning editions hit the streets. Now? Sarah's guns never wavered. About my mother's journal, hand it over. Slowly. Rawlins held the journal out, but his composed mask had cracked. There was something else in his eyes now. Not just anger or fear, but desperation. You don't understand what you're doing, the chaos you'll unleash. The territory isn't ready for the truth, like Las Cruces wasn't ready, Clay demanded. Like those families you burned. Necessary sacrifices, Rawlins insisted, for the greater good. The greater good? Sarah's laugh was harsh. Let's talk about the greater good, Rawlins. Let's talk about what's in those documents Clay found. The real reason you're here instead of sending more hired guns. She took a step forward, ignoring the pain in her wound. It's not just about land deals and corrupt judges anymore, is it? The papers mention something else, something about Indian treaties, massacre sites, mass graves that were never supposed to be found. Rawlins's face went absolutely still. Behind him, even his agent shifted uncomfortably. That's it, isn't it? Sarah pressed. The real secret. Not just corruption, genocide, planned, organized, and covered up by the very people claiming to civilize the territory. My grandfather's mines weren't just funding corrupt judges. They were built on burial grounds, on sacred sites, and my mother found proof. Your mother, Rawlins said quietly, was going to destroy everything we'd built, expose secrets that would have torn this territory apart, started a war that would have killed thousands. The war already happened, Clay growled. You just buried the bodies and rewrote history. Sarah's mind was racing, pieces falling into place. That's why you needed her alive at first. Why did you try to reason with her instead of just killing her like you did my father? You didn't know exactly what evidence she'd found or where she'd hidden it. The letter, Cole said suddenly, looking at the paper in his hands with new understanding. It's not just directions to hidden documents, is it? It's a record. Names, dates, locations. Give me the letter, boy. Rawlins's voice had taken on a dangerous edge. You have no idea what forces you're playing with. He's right about that much, came a new voice from the saloon doorway. Judge Wilson stepped out, supported by one of his men, blood staining his coat from where debris from the explosion had caught him. This goes beyond corrupt officials and land grabs. The very foundation of territorial authority rests on certain arrangements remaining secret. Arrangements. Sarah's voice dropped contempt. Is that what we're calling mass murder now? Your mother understood the necessity, Wilson insisted. She was born to this, raised in the shadow of power. She knew the price of progress. Until she didn't, Sarah finished. Until she decided the price was too high. Yes, Rawlins said softly. And look what that decision cost her. Cost your father. Cost everyone who tried to help them. His hand moved slowly to his coat. The question is, Catherine, what will it cost you? Everything happened at once. Rawlins went for a hidden derringer. Wilson's man raised a rifle. Jim's shotgun roared. Clay shouted a warning. But Sarah was already moving. Her first shot knocked the derringer from Rawlins' hand. Her second caught Wilson's man in the shoulder, spoiling his aim. The rifle shot went wide, shattering a saloon window. "The journal!" Clay called out. Rawlins had dropped it in the chaos. Sarah dove for the leather-bound book, but pain from her wound slowed her just enough. One of Rawlins's agents got there. First, snatching it up and tossing it to his boss. Rawlins caught the journal with a triumphant smile. "Last chance, Catherine. Join us, or—" The rest of his words were lost in a thunderous explosion as the hotel beside them erupted in flames. Through the smoke and confusion, Sarah heard more horses approaching. But these weren't reinforcements for either side. "Apache!" someone screamed. "The whole damn tribe!" Sarah looked up to see riders emerging from the smoke, proud warriors in war paint, led by a figure she recognized. Scout I. Wilson had mentioned spending time with the Jicarilla Apache, but he hadn't mentioned why. "You see," Clay said, satisfied in his voice, "while you were all focused on Sarah, I was making some new friends. Friends who are very interested in the location of their ancestors' graves, in justice for their murdered people." Rawlins's face had gone chalk white. "You fool! You'll start a war." "No," Sarah corrected him, rising despite her wound. "We're going to end one that's been going on in secret for far too long." She turned to the Apache leader. "The journal, the letter, they're what you've been looking for. Proof of what was done to your people." The warrior nodded gravely. "And now all will know the truth. The ghosts of our ancestors will finally rest." Rawlins looked around wildly, seeing his carefully maintained world crumbling. His agents were surrendering or fleeing. Wilson had collapsed, the old judge's strength finally giving out. Even the federal marshals were standing down, realizing they'd been on the wrong side of history. "It's over," Sarah said quietly. "The time for secrets is done." But Rawlins wasn't finished. With shocking speed, he pulled another hidden gun and grabbed Cole, pressing the barrel to the young deputy's head. "The letter," he demanded. "Now, or the boy dies, and your mother's last words die with him." Sarah's guns came up, but she couldn't risk the shot with Cole in the way. The Apache warriors notched arrows, but held their fire for the same reason. Cole, however, wasn't waiting to be rescued. The young deputy drove his elbow back into Rawlins's stomach, then threw his head back into the older man's face. As Rawlins staggered, Cole twisted free. "The letter!" Rawlins screamed, bringing his gun around. "You want it?" Cole straightened up, Sarah's mother's final confession clutched in his hand. "Here it is." The young deputy began to read, his clear voice carrying across the suddenly silent street. "My dearest friend, by the time you receive this, I will likely be dead, but the truth cannot die with me. The evidence is hidden where they'll never think to look, in plain sight in the territorial archives. The original treaties, the real maps, the orders for the massacres, all of it filed under Railroad Land Acquisitions, 1851. My father's signature is on every document, along with those of the other pillars of society who built their fortunes. On genocide? No," Rawlins whispered. "No, the archives burned. We made sure." "You burned a copy," Clay said with grim satisfaction. Elizabeth Harrison was smarter than that. She filed duplicates in every territorial office from here to Kansas, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to know where to look. Sarah kept her guns trained on Rawlins as the truth of his defeat sank in. "My mother died trying to expose what you'd done. My father died trying to bring justice to this territory. Seems only fitting that their sacrifices finally bear fruit." "You'll destroy everything," Rawlins said hoarsely. "The whole territory will collapse into chaos." "No," Sarah replied. "We'll rebuild it, on a foundation of truth this time, not bodies." She nodded to the Apache leader. "All the people's truth, not just the ones with power." Rawlins's gun came up one last time, whether aiming at Sarah, Cole, or the damning letter, no one would ever know. 5 shots rang out as one: Sarah's revolvers, Clay's rifle, Jim's shotgun, and an Apache arrow. Nathan Rawlins, the most powerful man in the territory, fell face first into the dust of Crimson Gulch. In his hand, Elizabeth Harrison's journal lay open, its pages stained with the blood of the man who had killed her. "Well," Clay said into the silence that followed, "reckon that's one way to start changing things." Sarah holstered her guns, feeling the weight of years lifting from her shoulders. "No, my friend, that's just the beginning of the changes coming. To this territory." She picked up her mother's journal, then turned to face the rising sun. In the distance, she could hear train whistles, morning editions racing toward every town in the territory, carrying truth instead of secrets for the first time in generations. The Devil's Daughter had finally found her real inheritance, justice. The sun climbed higher over Crimson Gulch, painting the aftermath of the night's violence in harsh relief. Rawlins's body had been carried to the undertakers, along with those of his men who hadn't surrendered. The street still bore the scars of the battle, splintered wood, broken glass, and dark stains that the morning dust would eventually cover. Sarah sat on the saloon's porch, her wound properly bandaged now, reading through her mother's journal while Clay and the others organized the prisoners. Each page revealed new layers of the conspiracy that had shaped her life and the territory's history for generations. "Found something interesting?" Jim asked, settling into the chair beside her with a grunt. The old man looked tired, but relieved, as if decades of carrying secrets had finally lifted from his shoulders. "Names," Sarah replied, not looking up. "So many names. Judges, governors, business leaders, all of them complicit in what was done to the tribes. All of them are profiting from death. Your grandfather's name appears often." Jim's voice was gentle. Sarah nodded, running her finger down another list of signatures. "On everything. Land deals, massacre orders, judicial appointments. He was at the center of it all. And my mother—" She swallowed hard. She was being groomed to take his place, to continue the legacy, until she chose a different path, Clay added, coming up the steps to join them. "I fell in love with an honest judge and started seeing things through different eyes." "Love has a way of changing perspective," Jim agreed. "Saw it happen with my own daughter, God rest her soul. Sometimes it takes seeing something through someone else's eyes to realize how wrong things are." Sarah closed the journal, her hands trembling slightly. "All those years, I thought I was avenging my father. Never knew I was also finishing my mother's work." The sound of hooves made them all look up. Cole was returning from the telegraph office, his young face serious with new responsibility. Behind him rode Thompson and several of his ranch hands, escorting the last of Rawlins's captured men. "Messages sent to every major newspaper in the territory," Cole reported, dismounting. "The full story, including the location of the documents in the archives. By nightfall, there won't be a town from here to Santa Fe that doesn't know the truth." "And Judge Morrison?" Clay asked. "Warned about the trap. Federal marshals are already moving to protect him. The hearing will proceed as scheduled, but with a few more honest guns on hand." Sarah nodded approval. "The Apache delegates headed to Santa Fe with copies of everything," Cole confirmed. "The territorial governor will have to acknowledge their claims now, with proof of the original treaties and—" he hesitated, "and the massacre orders." A heavy silence fell as they all contemplated the changes coming to the territory. Decades of carefully maintained corruption and lies were about to be exposed. The powerful families who had built their fortunes on stolen land and buried bodies would finally face justice. "Won't be easy," Jim said quietly. "Men like Rawlins, they've got friends in high places. Even with him gone, even with proof, some folks won't want to accept the truth. That's why we need to move fast," Clay replied. "Hit every archive, expose every secret before they can destroy more evidence. The newspapers will help. Nothing sells papers like scandal, and this is the biggest scandal in territorial history." Sarah stood, ignoring the protest from her wound. "Then we should get moving. Kane and his men are still out there, and there are others who worked for Rawlins who might try to stop us." About that, Thompson spoke up from where he'd been listening. "My boys talked to some folks in town. Kane and what's left of his gang were seen heading south toward Mexico. Reckon they know which way the wind's blowing." "Let them run," Sarah said dismissively. "They're just hired guns. The real fight will be with the families named in these papers, the pillars of society who built their empires on betrayal and murder. Your mother's family among them," Jim reminded her gently. Sarah's hand went to the cross at her neck, her mother's last gift. "Yes, the Harrisons will have to answer for their crimes, just like the others. No more special treatment. No more protected secrets." "Speaking of secrets," Clay interrupted, "there's still something we need to discuss." He pulled out the papers they'd taken from Rawlins' body. "These mention another set of documents, something even your mother might not have known about. Something about a place called Dead Man's Crossing." Sarah felt a chill despite the morning heat. "I know that name. It was in my father's papers, the night they arrested him. He was trying to tell me something about it, but they dragged him away before. It's a real place, Jim confirmed, his voice heavy with dark memory. Up in the high country. Used to be a mining camp before what happened there. What happened there? Cole asked. The old man shook his head. Those of us who know don't speak of it. Those who spoke of it didn't live long. But if there are documents about it in the territorial archives, then it's time the truth came out, Sarah finished. All of it. She turned to Clay. How long does it take to reach Santa Fe? 3 days of hard ride, he calculated, assuming no trouble along the way. Sarah almost laughed. When have we ever had no trouble? Fair point, Clay conceded with a grim smile. But we've got help this time. Thompson's men, the Apache allies, even some of the federal marshals seem to be coming around to our side. And me, Cole added firmly. My badge still means something, even if others corrupted theirs. Sarah looked at these men who had become more than allies. They were family now, bound by shared purpose and spilled blood. But she knew the price of such loyalty. This won't end in Santa Fe, she warned them. Even if we expose everything, even if Judge Morrison acts on the evidence, there will be consequences. Powerful people don't just give up their power. No, Jim agreed, standing with an old gunfighter's fluid grace. They don't. That's why they need to be shown they're not as powerful as they think. A commotion from the street drew their attention. One of Clay's men was riding in fast, his horse lathered with hard riding. Wire from Santa Fe, he called out, waving a telegram. Judge Morrison's been moved to a safe house, but there's more. The territorial governor just called an emergency. Session of the legislature. Word's already spreading about what happened here. They'll try to cover it up, Cole predicted. Pass laws to protect themselves. Too late, Clay said with satisfaction. The Apache delegates will reach the capital before they can act, and with copies of the evidence already spreading to every newspaper. They can't silence every voice, Sarah finished. She looked down at her mother's journal, then at the papers detailing Dead Man's Crossing. But they can still fight back. And they will. Jim checked his shotgun with practiced ease. Then we better be ready for them. The question is, where do we start? Sarah's eyes turned north, toward the high country where Dead Man's Crossing held its dark secrets. We start by finding out what was so important that even my mother didn't know about it. Whatever happened up there, it's the key to something bigger. Bigger than territorial corruption and hidden massacres? Cole sounded skeptical. According to these papers, yes. Clay's face was troubled. There are references to something called Project Exodus. Whatever it was, it scared Rawlins more than anything else we found. Sarah felt the weight of her guns, her mother's cross, the truth she now carried. Then that's where we're headed, Dead Man's Crossing. She turned to the others. I won't ask any of you to save it, Jim interrupted. We're way past asking. This is everybody's fight now. One by one, the others nodded. Even Thompson's ranch hands, who had only signed on to help catch some bandits, straightened with new purpose. Well then, Sarah said, strapping on her gun belt. Let's shed some light on Dead Man's Crossing. As they prepared to ride, Sarah took one last look at Crimson Gulch. The town had changed her, just as she had changed it. The Devil's Daughter had found something here she thought she'd lost forever. Not just allies or even friends, but family. A cause bigger than revenge. But as she mounted up, she felt something else too. A sense that everything up to now had just been preparation. Dead Man's Crossing was waiting, and with it secrets that even Rawlins had feared to expose. The wind carried the sound of distant thunder. Or perhaps it was the sound of change, rolling across the territory like a cleansing storm. Either way, Sarah Harrison, daughter of an honest judge and a brave woman who had died fighting corruption, was riding to meet it, and heaven help anyone who tries to stand in her way. The preparations for departure were interrupted by more riders approaching. From the east, not enemies this time, but townspeople returning from outlying farms and ranches. Word had spread about the morning's events, drawing folks back to see the aftermath for themselves. Among them was Reverend Thomas, the town's aging preacher, who made his way directly to where the other preacher had fallen. The old man knelt, in the dust, murmuring prayers over the spot where his dark reflection had met his end. Seems fitting, Jim observed, one man of God cleaning up after another's sins. Sarah watched the townspeople gathering, saw the mix of fear and hope in their faces. They're scared, she noted. Everything they thought they knew about who runs this territory, who makes the laws, it's all about to change. Change is always scary, Clay agreed, especially when it comes with guns and blood. A commotion near the telegraph office drew their attention. Two of Clay's men were arguing with Scout Eye Wilson, who had just returned from conferring with the Apache leaders. "Problem?" Sarah asked. Approaching the group, Scout Eye's weathered face was grave. Message from the Apache scouts watching the high country trails. "There's movement around Dead Man's Crossing. First time in years anyone's been seen up there." Rawlins's men, Clay wondered. "No." Scout Eye shook his head. "Different. Military wagons, by the tracks. And something else." He hesitated. "The Scouts say there's smoke coming from the old mine shafts, but it ain't regular smoke. It's wrong somehow. Makes the birds fall dead from the sky." Sarah exchanged looks with Clay. "Project Exodus," they said together. "There's something else," Scout Eye added. "The Apache elders, they've been telling stories, old stories about Dead Man's Crossing. Before it was a mining camp, it was a sacred site, a place of power, they say, but also a place of warning." "Warning? About what?" Cole asked. "About what sleeps in the deep places of the earth, about why some doors should stay closed." Scout Eye's voice dropped lower. "They say the miners didn't just find silver up there. They found something else, something that drove them mad before it killed them." Jim snorted. "Ghost stories." "Maybe," Sarah said thoughtfully. "But Rawlins was scared of something up there, something worth killing to keep secret." She turned to Clay. "Those military wagons. Regular army?" Clay's face darkened. "Doubt it. Probably Rawlins's private militia. The kind of men who do the real dirty work. Too dark, even for corrupt marshals." Sarah was about to respond when another rider came pounding up. One of Thompson's men, his horse nearly spent. "Wire from Carson City," he gasped, holding out a telegram. "You're going to want to see this." Clay took the paper, his expression growing grimmer as he read. "Well, that complicates things. The Harrison family patriarch, your grandfather, Sarah, he's called an emergency meeting of all the major families. They're gathering at Dead Man's Crossing in 2 days." "All of them?" Sarah felt her blood run cold. "Every family named in my mother's journal?" "Every last one, plus some names we don't know. Foreign investors, the telegram says. European money men with strange accents and strange interests." Jim whistled low. "A whole damn conspiracy gathering in one place. That's very convenient. Or very dangerous," Sarah finished. She looked at the papers about Project Exodus again. What could be important enough to bring them all together like this? After hiding in the shadows for so long, why risk exposure now? "Maybe they ain't got a choice," Scout Eye suggested. "Maybe whatever's up there in those mines, whatever's making that wrong smoke, maybe it ain't waiting anymore." The implications hung heavy in the air. Sarah looked around at her assembled allies. Clay with his reputation and his network of operators, Jim with his lifetime of secret knowledge, Cole with his young idealism and steady gun hand, Thompson's loyal ranchers, the Apache warriors, with their ancient wisdom and modern grievances. A strange army for a strange war. 2 days, she said finally. 2 days to reach Dead Man's Crossing, figure out what Project Exodus really is, and stop whatever my grandfather and his friends are planning. She managed a grim smile. "Does anyone want to back out now?" "Little late for that," Jim growled. "Besides, reckon we've all got skin in this game now." Cole nodded agreement. "This territory's been sick for a long time. Whether it's corruption or whatever's up in those mines, it needs healing. The Apache will ride with you, Scout Eye added. Our ancestors' bones lie in those hills. Their spirits cry out for resolution. Clay checked his rifle with practiced ease. Well, if we're really doing this, might as well do it right. He turned to his men. Send wires to every contact we've got. I want eyes on every trail to Dead Man's Crossing. If the Harrison family and their friends are gathering, I want to know exactly who shows up. And who doesn't, Sarah added thoughtfully, might tell us just as much about what's really going on. As the others dispersed to make preparations, Sarah felt a gentle touch on her arm. Reverend Thomas stood there, his kind old face troubled. I've been a minister in this town for 30 years, he said softly. Seen corruption wear many faces, call itself many names. Progress, necessity, manifest destiny. He shook his head sadly. But what you're riding into, it's something else. Something older than sin itself. What do you mean? The old man pressed something into her hand, a small silver cross, different from the one she wore. This belonged to the last man who tried to expose what happened at Dead Man's Crossing. He came to me for confession before they found him. The things he spoke of. The Reverend crossed himself. Just remember, child, there are some evils that can't be fought with guns alone. Sarah studied the cross. It was blackened on one side, as if burned by intense heat. You believe in ghosts, Reverend? I believe in evil, child, and I believe it takes many forms. He looked toward the northern mountains, where Dead Man's Crossing waited. Just be careful up there. Your mother's journal, your father's quest for justice. They may have only scratched the surface of what's really happening in this territory. As if to emphasize his words, another hot wind blew down from the mountains. But this one carried a strange smell, like sulfur and decay, mixed with something Sarah couldn't identify. Looking north, she saw storm clouds gathering over the high country, shot through with peculiar colors that had no place in any natural weather. Mount up, Clay called out. We ride in 10 minutes. Sarah tucked the Reverend's cross into her pocket alongside her mother's, feeling the weight of both against her heart. Whatever waited at Dead Man's Crossing, corruption or conspiracy, ghosts or darker things, she would face it with truth as her shield and justice as her sword. The Devil's Daughter was riding to war, and this time she was bringing an army. The trail to Dead Man's Crossing grew steeper with each passing mile, winding through stark canyons where the wind whispered strange echoes. Their group made an unusual sight. Lawmen and outlaws, Apache warriors and ranch hands, all united by the dark promises waiting in the high country. Sarah rode point with Clay and Scout Eye, while Jim and Cole led the main group behind them. The two crosses hung heavy around her neck, and her mother's journal seemed to burn in her saddlebag with the weight of its secrets. The storm's getting worse, Clay observed, eyeing the unnatural clouds that had been building since they left Crimson Gulch. Lightning flickered within them, but the colors were wrong, sickly greens and purples that had no place in nature. Not a storm, Scout Eye said quietly, a warning. The spirits are restless up here. They know what's coming. Sarah was about to respond when her horse suddenly balked, refusing to go further. The other animals were growing skittish too, rolling their eyes and fighting their riders' commands. There, Scout Eye pointed to the trail ahead. A dead crow lay in their path, its feathers untouched but its eyes clouded white. Beyond it lay another, and another, a trail of death leading around the next bend. Like you said, Sarah remembered. Birds falling from the sky. Clay dismounted to examine one of the corpses. No wounds, no sign of poison, just dead. The wrong smoke. Scout Eye nodded toward the heights above them. It's getting stronger. They had to lead their horses on foot after that. The animals too spooked to ride. As they rounded the bend, they got their first view of what had once been the mining camp of Dead Man's Crossing. The old buildings clung to the mountainside like scabs on an unhealed wound. weathered boards and rusted machinery, half hidden by years of neglect. But there was activity up there now. Lights moved in the darkness of the mine entrances, and fresh wagon tracks scarred the trail. Military wagons, just like you said, Clay muttered. But what are they hauling? Sarah studied the scene through her father's old spyglass. No supplies going in, but something's coming out. Look at the loading area. Clay took the glass, his face hardening as he looked. Crates. Heavy ones, by the way they're handling them. And those ain't regular soldiers. Private militia like we thought, but different somehow. How so? The way they move. Too stiff, too mechanical. And those uniforms ain't any I've ever seen. Scout Eye had been examining the ground, reading signs only he could see. Tracks tell a strange story. Men walking in, but something else walking out. A sound reached them then. A hollow, rhythmic clanking from deep within the mountain. It echoed off the canyon walls, making it impossible to tell its true source. With each echoing clank, the horses whimpered and tried to pull away. We need to get closer, Sarah decided. See what they're riders coming. Cole's urgent whisper carried from behind them. They quickly took cover as a group of horsemen approached from the direction they'd been headed. Sarah recognized some of the faces from her mother's journal, representatives of the powerful families that had built their fortunes on buried secrets. That's Jacob Harrison, Clay breathed. Your grandfather. Sarah studied the man who led the group. He sat on his horse like a king, his silver hair and expensive clothes marking him as nobility among the rougher men who accompanied him. But there was something else about him. Something in his bearing that spoke of absolute authority and absolute corruption. European investors with him, Scout Eye noted, but they don't sit on their horses right, like they ain't used to riding, or to have bodies that need to ride. Sarah was about to ask what he meant by that strange observation when one of the foreigners turned their way. Even at this distance, even through the shadows of the gathering storm, she could see that something was wrong with his eyes. They reflected the strange lightning like mirrors, pupilless and empty. What in God's name? Clay muttered. God ain't got much to do with what's up there, Scout Eye replied grimly. Old stories say this place was sacred long before white men came, sacred and feared. The people sealed something here generations ago, something that should have stayed sealed. The group of riders passed, heading up toward the mine entrance. As they disappeared into the gathering gloom, Sarah felt both. Crosses grow cold against her skin. We need to split up, she decided. Clay, take some men and scout the back trails. There must be another way in. Jim, you and Cole set up a fallback position here. If things go wrong, we'll need somewhere to retreat to. And you? Clay asked. Though he already knew the answer, Scout Eye and I are going to get closer. See what's really coming out of those mines. She patted her saddlebag. And find out what's in these papers that scared Rawlins so badly. The Apache warriors will cover the high ground, Scout Eye added. Watch for signals. As the others moved to their positions, Sarah felt Jim's hand on her shoulder. Be careful, girl. Your mother tried to expose these people's secrets once before. I know, but she didn't have an army at her back. Sarah managed a grim smile. Besides, something tells me this is bigger than just corruption now. That's what worries me, the old man replied. Sarah and Scout Eye worked their way closer to the mine complex, using the growing darkness for cover. The strange storm above them was getting worse, the unnatural lightning casting everything in sickly hues. The clanking sound was louder now, and it had developed a rhythm, like massive machinery, but with an organic quality that made Sarah's skin crawl. From one of the mine entrances, thick smoke poured out, smoke that moved against the wind and glowed with an inner light. There, Scout Eye pointed to a smaller tunnel entrance, partially hidden behind fallen timber. Old ventilation shaft. Might lead inside. They were about to move toward it when voices drifted down from above. Sarah recognized her grandfather's commanding tone. The final shipment must be ready by midnight. Our European friends are most eager to see the fruits of Project Exodus. The containment fields are failing faster than expected. This voice was accented, emotionless. The barrier between worlds grows thin. Then we accelerate the timeline. Once the devices are activated in every major city, there will be no need for containment. The way will be opened permanently. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Beside her, Scout Eye made a warding gesture she'd seen the Apache warriors use earlier. "The papers," she whispered, pulling them from her saddlebag. In the strange stormlight, she could finally make out sections that had been too damaged to read before. Project Exodus, final phase. Through the combined application of sacred geometries and modern sciences, we have succeeded in creating a stable breach between our world and the other. The entities we have contacted assure us that their technology, combined with our resources, will usher in a new age of progress. The human sacrifices required are regrettable, but necessary. The document went on, growing more horrific with each line. This wasn't just corruption or land theft. This was something far worse. A conspiracy spanning generations, involving forces that should never have been awakened. The mining, Sarah realized. It wasn't about silver. They were digging for something else. Something your people sealed. Away, Scout Eye nodded grimly. The Old Ones, entities that walked this land before the people, before any human eyes saw these mountains. Our ancestors fought a war to seal them away, and now my grandfather and his friends are trying to let them back in. Sarah felt sick. All the land grabs, all the massacres, they were clearing the way, removing anyone who might remember the old warnings. A new sound joined the clanking. Rhythm from the mines, chanting in a language that hurt Sarah's ears. The strange smoke began to coalesce into shapes that her mind refused to fully comprehend. "We have to stop them," she said. "Whatever they're planning for midnight, whatever. These devices are they're sending to the cities. We have to end this. Maybe this is what your mother found," Scout Eye suggested. Why did they have to silence her so quickly? Sarah touched both crosses at her neck, feeling their cold weight. "Then we finish what she started. But first—" She pulled out her mother's journal, turning to the final pages. "First we need to know exactly what we're dealing with." As lightning cast its sickly glow over the pages, Sarah began to read her mother's last warnings about the true nature of Project Exodus and the price of progress that would be paid in blood and souls rather than mere dollars. The Devil's Daughter was about to discover that some family legacies were darker than she could have imagined. Sarah's hands trembled as she read her mother's final journal entries by the otherworldly stormlight. August 15th, 1882. What I've discovered in Father's private library defies all Christian understanding. The mining surveys were never about silver or gold. They were searching for specific geometric patterns in the rock, places where what they call the barrier is thinnest. The European investors, God help us, I don't believe they're human at all. August 17th. The sacrifices weren't just murder, they were ritual. Every massacre, every accident in the mines, every hanging, all precisely calculated to weaken the ancient seals. Father speaks of resonance and breakthrough, but all I hear in his words is madness. August 20th. William suspects something. My dear honest judge, still believing this is merely about corruption and land theft. I cannot tell him the full truth. He would never believe that his own father-in-law communes with entities that have no place in God's creation. The devices they're constructing in the mines, they look like machinery, but they pulse with a life of their own. August 21st. They know. Somehow they know I've discovered everything. Father came to me today, offered me a choice. Join them in what he calls the Great Ascension or be silenced. When I refused, I saw something move behind his eyes, something that wore his face like a mask. I leave this journal as my testimony. William, my love, forgive me for not telling you sooner. Catherine, my precious daughter, if you ever read this. The final entry trailed off into a shaky scrawl. Dark stains marked the page. Blood, Sarah realized. Her mother's blood. The devices, Scout Eye said quietly. Like the ones they're loading now? Sarah nodded, fighting down nausea. She died, trying to warn everyone. And now they're ready to... To what? What is this ascension they're planning? A burst of that strange lightning illuminated the mine complex, and for a moment they saw shapes moving around the wagons, shapes that didn't match the shadows they cast. The Europeans her grandfather had called investors walked with jerky, unnatural movements, as if their bodies were poorly fitted clothes. From their hidden vantage point, Sarah and Scout Eye could see more wagons being loaded. The crates they carried hummed with an inner resonance that made their teeth ache. 6 wagons, Sarah counted, headed to 6 different cities according to these papers. Santa Fe, Denver, Kansas City. She studied the maps included with the Project Exodus documents. They form a pattern, a hexagon, with Dead Man's Crossing at the center. Sacred geometry. Scout Eye nodded grimly. The old ones understand such patterns, use them to move between worlds. The chanting from the mine grew louder, and with it came a new sound, a deep thrumming that they felt in their bones. The strange smoke began to take more solid form, coalescing into shapes that seemed to bend space around them. We need to warn. The others, Sarah started to say, but movement near the main mine entrance caught her attention. Her grandfather had emerged, accompanied by 2 of the European investors. In the stormlight, their true nature was becoming harder to disguise. Their skin rippled like oil on water, and their movements were increasingly inhuman. The alignment approaches, one of them said in that flat, empty voice. The resonance. Patterns are achieving harmony. Jacob Harrison's answering laugh was triumphant. After 3 generations of preparation, it's finally happening. My grandfather began this work, my father continued it, and now I will see it completed. The old barriers between worlds will fall, and humanity will be elevated to its true potential. Elevated. The thing wearing human shape made a sound that might have been amusement. Yes, let us call it that. Your species has such fascinating euphemisms for consumption. Sarah felt her blood run cold. Before she could process the implications of what she'd heard, Scout Eye grabbed her arm in warning. More figures were emerging. From the smaller mine entrances, men in mining clothes, but moving with that same mechanical stiffness. Their eyes reflected the strange lightning like mirrors. Your mother's journal, Scout Eye whispered urgently. What else does it say about the devices? Sarah flipped through the pages with shaking hands, finding another entry. The devices appear mechanical, but they're actually organic, grown rather than built. Father calls them resonators, or sometimes keys. When activated, they create some kind of doorway. But the test subjects they've sent through, what comes back isn't human anymore. Their bodies move, but their eyes... God help me, their eyes are empty. A horrible realization struck her. The miners, she breathed. The original miners from when this was a real silver mine. They didn't die in accidents. They were test subjects. Scout Eye nodded grimly. Walking hollow, empty vessels waiting to be filled. He pointed to the miners emerging from the tunnels. Like them. Sarah watched in horror as more figures joined the loading operation, dozens of them now, all moving, with that unnatural precision. Some she recognized from old photographs in her mother's journal, miners who had supposedly died years ago, prominent citizens who had mysteriously disappeared, even faces she knew from wanted posters. "They've been building their army," she whispered, "right here, right under everyone's nose. Every disappearance, every accident. They were building their army one body at a time." The implications were staggering. Not just the immediate threat of whatever was planned for midnight, but the scope of the conspiracy itself. Generations of careful preparation, all leading to this moment. A sharp whistle cut through the ethereal storm sounds, Clay's signal for urgent danger. Sarah and Scout. I turned to see riders approaching from the south trail. Even at this distance, she recognized Kane's men among them. "They must have followed us," Sarah growled, "or someone warned them." More than that, Scout Eye pointed to the ridgeline where they'd left the Apache warriors. Dark shapes moved against the strange sky, more of those hollow-eyed figures, emerging from hidden mine entrances they hadn't known existed. They were being surrounded. "We have to warn the others," Sarah said, reaching for her gun. "Get word to Clay, to Jim and Cole. Whatever's happening at midnight, we have to stop those wagons from reaching the cities." "Maybe it's too late," Scout Eye replied. "Look." The massive doors of the main mine entrance were opening fully for the first time. Within that cavernous space, something pulsed with a light that hurt their eyes. The chanting reached a fever pitch, and the very air seemed to ripple like heat waves off sun-baked rock. "Mother of God," Sarah breathed. "What are they bringing through?" Scout Eye's face was grim. Not bringing through, letting out. The old ones never left this world. They were only imprisoned. And now my grandfather and his friends are setting them free. Sarah checked her guns with trembling hands. "How do we fight something like this?" "The same way your mother tried to," Scout Eye replied. "With truth, with courage, and—" He touched the crosses at her neck. "With faith." Sarah felt the weight of both crosses, felt the truth of her mother's sacrifice and her father's quest for justice. This was bigger than revenge now, bigger than exposing corruption or righting past wrongs. This was about saving not just the territory, but perhaps the world itself. "Signal Clay," she ordered, her voice steady despite her fear. "Tell him to start, moving people into position. Whatever comes out of that mine at midnight, we'll be ready for it." As Scout Eye moved to relay the signals, Sarah opened her mother's journal one last time, turning to the very last page. There, in shaky handwriting, was a final message she hadn't noticed before. "Catherine, my darling daughter, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about our family's legacy. But remember, darkness isn't inherited. Evil isn't in the blood. It's in the choices we make. Your grandfather chose power over humanity. I chose truth over safety. The choice before you now is even greater. Be brave, my love. Be just. Be the light that pushes back the darkness." "All my love, Mother," Sarah touched the words, feeling their power like a physical force. Then she checked her guns one final time and prepared to face whatever horrors midnight would bring to Dead Man's Crossing. The Devil's Daughter was about to learn that some family reunions are fought with bullets, while others are fought with faith. This one, she suspected, would require both. The strange storm above Dead Man's Crossing reached its peak as midnight approached. Lightning in impossible colors branched between earth and sky, while the wind carried whispers in languages that had no business being spoken by human tongues. Sarah crouched behind a rusted ore cart, both her father's revolvers loaded and ready. Around the mine complex, her allies waited in the shadows. Clay's men, the Apache warriors, even Thompson's ranch hands, who had chosen to stay despite the horrors they'd witnessed. Jim and Cole had positioned themselves near the wagon trail, ready to prevent any of the devices from leaving the mountain. 10 minutes to midnight, Scout Eye whispered from beside her. The barrier grows thinner with each passing moment. The main mine entrance had become a portal of writhing light, its massive doors fully open now. The chanting from within had reached a fever pitch, accompanied by that deep, mechanical thrumming that seemed to resonate with something in their bones. Through her spyglass, Sarah watched her grandfather directing the loading operation. Jacob. Harrison stood like a conductor before an orchestra of the damned, his fine clothes now adorned with symbols that hurt the eyes to look at directly. The European investors had all but abandoned their human pretense, their forms rippling and shifting in ways that defied natural law. "The wagons are almost ready to move." Clay's voice came soft but urgent through the darkness. "We have to act soon." Sarah nodded, though her whole body trembled with the wrongness of what she was seeing. The hollow-eyed miners, men who should have died years ago, worked with mechanistic precision, loading the humming devices into reinforced crates. Kane's men had joined them, their normal outlaw swagger replaced by that same unnatural stiffness. "They're all connected now," Scout Eye observed. "Join whatever's coming through that doorway, like puppet strings, but pulled from another world." A particularly bright burst of lightning illuminated the scene, and for a moment Sarah saw the truth of his words. Faint lines of force, visible only in that otherworldly light, stretched from the mine entrance to each of the transformed men. They weren't just controlled. They were being remade, rebuilt from the inside out to serve whatever entities her grandfather had made his deal with. "Sarah." Clay's voice carried real fear now. "Something's coming." The thrumming reached a new pitch that set their teeth on edge. From the mine entrance emerged something, a shape that refused to resolve into anything comprehensible, a mass of angles and geometries that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. Where it passed, reality itself seemed to warp and bend. "The old ones," Scout Eye breathed, making warding gestures. "The sealed ones, breaking free." Jacob Harrison spread his arms wide in welcome. "The moment of ascension is here. The pattern is complete. The resonators are ready. When midnight strikes, the devices will create a web of power across the territory, opening the way for our benefactors to—" "That's close enough, grandfather." Sarah's voice cut through the chaos as she stepped out of hiding, both revolvers trained on him. Around the complex, her allies emerged from the shadows, guns raised, arrows nocked, all facing the abomination taking shape in their world. Harrison turned slowly, seeming unsurprised. "Catherine, I wondered if you would come. Your mother had the same stubborn streak, the same inability to see the greater purpose at work here." "I see just fine," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite her terror. "I see what you really are. A traitor to humanity itself. Those benefactors of yours, they're not here to elevate us, they're here to consume us." The thing in the doorway pulsed with sickly light, and Harrison's smile became something inhuman. "Consumption, ascension, evolution. The words don't matter, my dear. Only the outcome. A new world with our family at its heart. Join us, Catherine. Take your rightful place in—" The crack of Sarah's revolver cut him off. The bullet struck him square in the chest, but instead of blood, the wound leaked that strange, moving smoke. "How long?" she demanded. "How long have you not been human?" Harrison looked down at the wound, with almost academic interest. "Longer than you've been alive, my dear. The price of touching divinity is changing. Your mother understood that in the end, in her final moments as she was being elevated." "You son of a—" Sarah's second shot was drowned out by the sound of multiple guns opening up. Her allies had begun firing at the transformed miners and Kane's men, who were advancing with terrifying coordination. "You cannot stop what's coming," Harrison said calmly, as bullets passed through him harmlessly. "The pattern is already established. The resonators are charged." At midnight, he was cut off by a massive explosion that rocked the mountainside. Jim and Cole had dynamited the wagon trail, sending two of the device-laden wagons plummeting into the canyon. "The pattern," Harrison's calm finally broke. "You'll destroy everything." "That's the idea," Sarah replied. She turned to Scout Eye. "Now, The Apache warrior raised an ancient horn to his lips and blew a single, pure note that cut through the chaos. From the ridgelines, more horns answered, not just from the Apache warriors, but from deeper in the mountains. Ancient warnings, ancient defenses awakening once more. The thing in the doorway recoiled, its impossible geometries wavering. The transformed miners stumbled, the puppet strings controlling them momentarily weakened. The old songs, Scout Eye said with fierce satisfaction, the ones that helped seal them away before. Your grandfather's benefactors remember them well. Sarah felt both crosses at her neck grow warm, pushing back against the supernatural cold that had settled over the mountain. This was what her mother had discovered, not just the conspiracy, but the means to fight it. The old ways, the old songs, the old faith that had helped imprison these entities before. "Clay!" she shouted. "The devices!" Her old partner and his men opened up on the remaining wagons, targeting the crates containing the resonators. As each one was destroyed, the humming in their bones decreased. The pattern Harrison had spent generations creating was unraveling. But the thing in the doorway wasn't retreating. If anything, it was pushing harder against the barriers of reality, forcing its way through. The transformed miners and Kane's men pressed their attack with inhuman strength, heedless of bullets, even. "If you destroy the resonators," Harrison called out, his voice distorting, "you cannot close what has been opened. The old ones will walk this world again." Sarah looked at her mother's journal, then at the crosses she wore. An idea struck her. Crazy, desperate, but somehow right. "Scout Eye," she said urgently. "The sacred geometry they used to open the doorway. Could it be reversed?" The old scout's eyes widened with understanding. Yes, the pattern turned back on itself. "Could seal them away again," Sarah finished. She turned to Clay. "Get everyone clear of the mine entrance. I know what has to be done." "Sarah, no," Clay protested. "Whatever you're thinking—" "My mother died trying to stop this," she cut him off. "My father died because he got too close to the truth. Their blood runs in my veins, and so does his." She looked at her grandfather with cold determination. "Harrison blood. The blood they used to open this doorway in the first place." Understanding dawned on Harrison's face. "You wouldn't dare. The backlash would—" Sarah's smile was fierce. "Scout Eye, start the songs again. Everyone else fall back. This ends now." Before anyone could stop her, she charged toward the mine entrance, firing both revolvers to clear a path through the transformed men. The crosses burned against her skin as she ran, and she felt something stirring in her blood. A power that had been there all along, waiting to be used for either salvation or damnation. "I choose the light," she whispered her mother's words. "I choose the truth." She reached the threshold just as midnight struck. The thing in the doorway loomed over her, reality warping around its impossible form. Behind her, the Apache songs rose in power, joined by prayers in a dozen languages as her allies added their faith to the fight. Sarah held up both crosses, letting her blood, Harrison blood, but cleansed by sacrifice and justice, complete a very different kind of pattern. "You want a doorway!" she screamed into the chaos. "Here's your doorway!" The world exploded in light and sound. Sarah felt the power of generations of Harrison blood, all the energy they'd used to weaken the barriers being turned back on itself. The doorway began to collapse, reality snapping back like a rubber band. "No." Her grandfather's voice had lost all pretense of humanity. "You'll doom us all." "No, grandfather," Sarah replied calmly. "Just you and your kind." The last thing she saw before consciousness faded was the thing in the doorway being drawn back, pulled into a prison rebuilt with the very power that had released it. Her grandfather's transformed body dissolved into smoke and vanished with it. Then darkness took her. Sarah awoke to sunlight and the smell of sage. She was lying in a tent, bandaged but alive. Outside she could hear normal sounds, birds singing, horses nickering, people talking in human voices. "Welcome back," Clay said from beside her. "You've been out for 3 days. The doorway, sealed, whatever you did up there, it worked." The mine entrance collapsed, taking all those abominations with it. The transformed men, when the door closed, their bodies just fell empty. Sarah touched her neck, finding both crosses still there. The devices, the other mines, all destroyed. "The Apache riders are checking every site mentioned in your mother's journal, but it seems the pattern is broken for good." She tried to sit up, wincing at the pain. "The territory is in chaos," Clay admitted, "but the good kind. The documents you found, the ones about the land deals and massacres, they're doing their work. The governor's resigned, half the territorial judges are under arrest, and Judge Morrison is leading a full investigation. And my grandfather's associates, gone. Back to whatever hell they came from. Though folks are already trying to pretend none of it happened. Easier to believe stories about corruption than whatever the truth really was." Sarah nodded, understanding. Some truths were too big, too terrible for most people to face. But they would be remembered where it mattered. In Apache songs, in frontier legends, in the quiet prayers of those who had seen what really lurked in the high country. "What now?" she asked softly. Clay smiled. "Well, the territory needs honest judges more than ever, and who better to help rebuild the system than someone who knows exactly how it was corrupted? Morrison's offering you a position once you're healed up." Sarah thought about it, about justice through law instead of guns, about building something good from the ashes of her family's evil. "My mother would like that," she said finally. "Yes," Clay agreed. "Yes, she would." Outside, the sun shone. On a territory forever changed. Old powers had been sealed away, old corruptions exposed, old wrongs set right. And if sometimes, on dark nights, people heard strange whispers from the high country, well, that was what prayers and crosses and Apache songs were for. The devil's daughter had become something else. A builder of justice, a keeper of better secrets, a guardian against darker things than mere human evil. And somewhere, she knew, her parents were proud. In the weeks that followed, Sarah watched the territory begin to heal. The Apache tribes reclaimed their sacred sites, their songs now carrying new verses about the battle at Dead Man's Crossing. The mining companies, their corrupt leadership exposed, underwent dramatic reorganization under honest management. Land was returned, grievances were addressed, and a new kind of justice began to take root. But there were other changes too, subtler ones that few would ever connect to that night on the mountain. "Another one," Cole said one morning, dropping a newspaper on Sarah's desk in the newly established Territorial Justice Office. The headline spoke of a prominent businessman found dead in his study, his body mysteriously desiccated, his eyes turned to mirrors. "The third this month," Sarah noted grimly. "They're not all going quietly." She knew what it meant. Not all of her grandfather's transformed allies had been caught in the closing door. Some had escaped, hiding in human form, trying to rebuild what had been lost. But without the power of Dead Man's Crossing sustaining them, they were slowly decaying. "The Apache hunters are tracking the last of them," Clay reported, entering with his own stack of reports. "Scout Eye says they leave signs only his people can read. Disturbances in the natural world, animals acting strange, that sort of thing." Sarah touched the crosses she still wore. They remained warm against her skin, as if retaining some echo of the power they had channeled that night. "And the other sites, the other mines?" "All sealed," Clay confirmed. "Whatever your grandfather and his friends were trying to wake up, it's sleeping sound now. Though..." He hesitated. "What is it?" Some of the Apache scouts report hearing things deep in the sealed mines, like something scratching at the doors we closed, especially on nights when the moon is dark. Sarah nodded slowly. We didn't destroy them, just locked them away again. The old stories say they can never be truly destroyed, only contained, only guarded against. Then I reckon the territory needs guardians as much as it needs judges, Cole observed. He was right, Sarah knew. The visible work of justice, prosecuting corrupt officials, returning stolen land, setting right decades of wrongs, was only part of her new responsibility. The other part involved watching the dark places, keeping the old songs alive, making sure certain doors stayed closed. Jim appeared in the doorway, looking more respectable now in his new role as territorial marshal, though he still kept that shotgun close at hand. Riders coming in from the north, he reported, say they've found something in the ruins of another old mining camp, something that glows in the dark and whispers. Sarah rose, checking her guns out of habit. She rarely needed them for normal law work these days, but for other matters, show me. As they rode out, she felt the weight of everything she carried, her father's revolvers, her mother's journal, the crosses that had helped seal an otherworldly door. But she also felt the strength of what she had gained, allies who understood, both human justice and older powers, a purpose that went beyond revenge and a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect the territory. The sun was setting as they crested a rise overlooking the northern valleys. In the distance, storm clouds were gathering, natural ones this time, bringing normal rain to nourish the land. But Sarah kept a close eye on their color, knowing now what signs to watch for. "You know," Clay said as they rode, "your mother's last journal entry. There was something we never decoded, that series of numbers and letters at the very end." Sarah smiled slightly. A map, locations of other evidence she'd hidden, other secrets she'd discovered, enough to keep us busy for years making things right, and watching for things trying to break back through. That too. Sarah touched the crosses again. There's always something scratching at the door, trying to get in, whether it's human corruption or something else. The trick is making sure there are always people willing to stand guard. They rode on as the sun sank toward the horizon. Somewhere in the distance, Apache songs drifted on the wind, old songs mixed with new verses about the battle at Dead Man's Crossing, about the devil's daughter who chose light over darkness, about doors that must stay closed and truths that must be remembered. Sarah Harrison, daughter of a murdered judge and a brave woman who died fighting evil, rode to meet whatever new challenge awaited. She had found her true inheritance, not in Harrison blood or corrupt power, but in the choice to stand between light and darkness, between justice and evil, between this world and the hungry void that waited beyond thin doors. The devil's daughter had become something her parents would have recognized, something the territory desperately needed, a guardian of both human law and older truths. A judge who understood that justice sometimes wore a gun and carried crosses, a protector of boundaries both legal and mystical, and if sometimes, on dark nights, she heard whispers from the sealed mines or saw strange lights in the high country, well, that was what she had been born to face. That was the real Harrison legacy, not the evil her grandfather had embraced, but the duty to stand against it. The storm clouds grew darker as they rode north, but Sarah watched them without fear. She knew what signs to look for now, knew what songs to sing, knew how to tell natural darkness from the other kind. After all, that's what guardians were for. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.